The satellite went blind at exactly 1:47. For 6 minutes and 32 seconds, a corridor across the Sahel, 300 kilometers wide, stretching from the border of Niger to the outskirts of Ouagadougou, simply vanished from every Western surveillance grid. No malfunction, no storm, just silence where there should have been a signal. By the time the feed returned, something had already moved, something no one was supposed to see. October 10, 2025. Intelligence officers in Langley, Paris, and Brussels would spend the next 72 hours trying to reconstruct what crossed that blind spot. The answer, when it came, was not in their databases. It was already on the ground. A convoy, 23 vehicles, no insignia, no transponders, carrying Chinese-made fire support systems, 70-kilometer range rocket launchers, and a cargo far heavier than steel, the end of permission. For decades, Africa had been told, wait for approval, depend on aid, borrow your own security, as if sovereignty were a subscription service that could be cancelled at will. But that night, in the span of 6 minutes and 32 seconds, the script was rewritten. Not with speeches, not with summits, but with engines that moved through the dark as if they had always known the way. Western analysts would likely describe it as a breach of protocol. Beijing said nothing. But across the Sahel, people understood what the silence meant. Dependency had died in the desert, and no one had asked for permission to bury it. Because here is what power fears most, not rebellion, but irrelevance. And when a continent stops waiting for protection and simply takes it, the only question left is whether the world will catch up or be left behind. If you feel that shift, if something in you recognizes the weight of a moment that changes everything, then stay with us, like this video, drop a comment, subscribe. Not because we ask, but because some stories demand witnesses, and this one has only just begun. The first engine started at 0200 hours exactly. No headlights, no radio traffic, just a faint red glow from instrument panels cutting through the Sahel's absolute dark. From the northern edge of Ouagadougou to the road toward Kaya, the convoy moved like a shadow that had learned to carry weight. Dust rose behind them, silent and heavy, as if the ground itself understood that something irreversible was underway. Inside the lead vehicle sat Captain Ibrahim Traoré, 36 years old, a soldier who had become a statesman not by ambition, but by watching too many promises dissolve in the heat of the Sahel. His hands rested on the radio console, not gripping it, not commanding through it, just resting there, steady, as if the silence itself were a kind of answer. He remembered the years when every call for help had to travel north, to Paris, to Brussels, to Washington. How answers always arrived too late, or not at all. How villages burned while diplomats debated timelines. How mothers whispered, they told us peace was coming, their voices carrying more weight than any treaty ever signed. That night, there would be no waiting. In the cargo trucks behind him, 6 VN-22B fire support vehicles, their barrels wrapped in tarps to shield them from the dust and from satellites that might still be watching. 4 SR-5 multiple rocket launchers, capable of 70-kilometer precision strikes technology that, until recently, had been considered too advanced for African hands. 2 WZ-551 command carriers with integrated coordination systems. Alongside them, a column of tactical trucks, 14 in total, each one carrying ammunition, spare parts, and something less tangible but far more dangerous. Proof that dependency was a choice, not a destiny. The numbers mattered less than the meaning. For the first time, these were not gifts, not loans, not foreign aid with strings attached like puppet wires. They had been purchased and financed through the National Sovereignty Fund, a reserve built from Burkina Faso's own gold exports. Established in 2024, after the final Western training mission withdrew and left nothing behind but empty barracks and broken radios. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, China now accounts for nearly 1/5 of all major arms imports into sub-Saharan Africa. Once, that statistic had lived only in reports, footnotes buried in documents no one read. Tonight, it moved in steel and intent. Every nation in the Sahel had seen what followed the Western withdrawal: empty bases, broken promises, villages left to defend themselves against insurgents with nothing but improvised weapons and fading hope. The coalition missions had called it strategic transition. On the ground, it had felt like abandonment with a press release. Traore had visited those villages. He had walked through burnt fields where schools had been turned into barracks, where children no longer played because the sound of laughter might draw attention. He had listened to mothers who no longer spoke above a whisper, as if volume itself were dangerous. That was the sound he remembered when the engines started that night. Not the rumble of machinery, but the silence of people who had waited too long. As the convoy rolled deeper into the dark, a radio transmission flickered across an old military frequency, one that had once belonged to French forces, now abandoned like everything else they had left behind. Static. Then silence, then nothing. Traore looked at his driver, a young man barely 23, whose hands gripped the wheel with the kind of focus that comes only from knowing the stakes. "Keep moving," Traore said quietly. Every kilometer forward was a statement. Every kilometer was a refusal. We will defend ourselves. Not because we were given permission, but because permission itself is the language of the powerless. Western analysts, those who even bothered to pay attention, would later call it unthinkable. A small African nation conducting a multi-$100 million defense procurement without Western supervision, without oversight, without the signatures of banks in New York or London. Ibrahim Traoré's news would eventually trickle into think tanks and policy briefings, framed as a curiosity, a footnote, an anomaly that didn't fit the script. But for many across the Sahel, it was not unthinkable. It was inevitable. For decades, sovereignty had been a word on paper, signed in languages most people didn't speak, negotiated in rooms most people would never enter. That night, it became a weight on wheels. It became something you could hear, something you could feel in the vibration of the earth, as 23 vehicles rolled past. When dawn approached, the convoy reached a fortified hangar on the northern edge of Ouagadougou. The engines shut down one by one, leaving behind a silence so thick you could almost touch it. Soldiers stood beside their vehicles, faces half lit by the first pale thread of light creeping over the horizon, exhausted, uncertain, but standing. One of them, a young lieutenant barely 23, whispered to no one in particular, "We finally own something that can defend us." Traore turned to him, his voice quiet but unyielding. "No," he said. "We finally own the right to defend ourselves." Outside, the desert wind carried the sound toward the horizon. A sound that by morning would echo beyond Burkina Faso's borders, beyond the Sahel, beyond the neat categories that analysts use to explain away the inconvenient. To the west, it would be a footnote. To Africa, it was the start of a sentence that had waited 60 years to be spoken. Because history does not always begin with a gunshot, a declaration, or a flag raised in triumph. Sometimes it starts with an engine in the dark, and the decision to keep it running. How long can a continent wait for protection from those who never arrive? Let us pause here not to move away, but to move closer. What you have just heard is not simply machinery crossing borders. It is dignity reclaiming its voice. If this resonates with you, if something in your chest tightens at the thought of people no longer asking permission to protect what is theirs, then take this moment to leave a comment. Just 2 words: thank you. Thank you to Traore, thank you to Burkina Faso, thank you to the spirit of sovereignty itself. Gratitude is not a formality, it is recognition, it is dignity expressed in words. When you add your voice of thanks, you are not just engaging with a video, you are standing in solidarity with a story that history tried to silence. So before we continue, pause, type your thank you. Let it be part of something larger than yourself. Because together, those words become a chorus that reaches far beyond this screen. By sunrise, the engines were silent. But inside the presidential compound of Ouagadougou, a different kind of noise had begun. The low hum of decision. Captain Ibrahim Traoré sat before his National Security Council, 12 men and women whose faces carried the exhaustion of a generation that had waited too long for promises to become real. On the wall behind them hung a faded map of the Sahel, its borders drawn by hands that had never walked its soil, never felt its heat, never buried children in its dust. He pointed to it and asked a question that history had long avoided. How much longer do we wait for others to protect what is ours? No one answered. They did not need to. The answer had arrived with the convoy. Across the table lay the latest report from the Ministry of Defense. France had ended Operation Barkhane. The European Union had suspended training funds. The United States had downgraded its regional presence to an advisory capacity, which in practice meant relying on satellite imagery and maintaining polite indifference. What remained were empty runways, rusting equipment, and endless promises of future cooperation, a phrase that had become a kind of diplomatic graveyard where hope went to die. For Traore, the arithmetic was brutally simple. Waiting had become more dangerous than acting. Dependency had become more costly than independence. And so, That same afternoon, he signed a decree establishing the National Sovereignty Fund, a self-financed defense account backed by the country's gold reserves and agricultural exports. The goal was clear: to replace dependence with discipline, to buy security rather than borrow it, to make sovereignty something more than a word in treaties no one read. The fund was modest by global standards, roughly $250 million, but symbolically it was priceless. For the first time in living memory, Burkina Faso could purchase defense systems without the signatures of Western banks, without the oversight of foreign advisors, without the implicit understanding that protection was something granted by those who could also take it away. Traore referred to it as the doctrine of necessity. It was not ideology, it was survival mathematics. When aid becomes scarce and threats become constant, necessity itself becomes a strategic tool. And when necessity becomes strategy, the old rules, the ones written in distant capitals by people who would never live with the consequences, cease to apply. Through this doctrine, Ouagadougou turned east, not out of loyalty to Beijing or ideological alignment, but out of logic. China's Norinco Corporation offered what others had withheld: technology, training, and most importantly, respect for sovereignty. As one Burkina officer put it, off the record, in a CAF where such things could still be said aloud, they deliver equipment, not lectures. Meanwhile, in Washington and Paris, policymakers struggled to interpret the shift. News from Burkina Faso began appearing in intelligence briefings, framed as a puzzle that did not fit the usual categories. Reports labeled it China's quiet militarization of Africa. Analysts warned of a new Cold War theater, as if the Sahel were simply a stage for someone else's drama. Yet few stopped to ask the question that mattered most: why had the continent turned away in the first place? The truth was uncomfortable. When protection becomes conditional,